when we made Mona Lisa, I was constantly aware that Neil Jordan's relationship with London was entirely different from my relationship. For instance, as someone who's born in London and grew up in London, I take for granted so much of what I see around me, and the entire architecture of London is something which it's my city in a way. You know, grew up in North London, and the whole tube map was sort of ingrained in my head. And you know, I never learned to drive until I was in my 30s, and that's because I was living in a foreign country. I was living in Los Angeles, but the entire sort of scope of London was something that I was conscious of. But if you look at another film, Blow Up, which is Antonioni's version of London, and as I say, Polanski's version of London, I think Mona Lisa is a film where you really see Neil Jordan's version of London. And I think as an Irishman who had lived in London for a while when he was younger, when he came here, I think, to work on construction sites, and was sort of living in London on a sort of on the kind of lowest level of poverty in a way. I think his view of London is quite unique in Mona Lisa, and I think the choice of locations that he made, the environment that you see Bob and Robbie Coltrane's character living in, Bob Hoskins' character and Robbie Coltrane's character is living in a sort of strange caravan in a strange place that seems to be off the river somewhere, is not a London that you would automatically presume to see in films that have been made since and have been made previously about London. It was a strange, not only a snapshot of an older London, in particular the lift sequence with the hand lift and the whole tension that Neil has in that scene is more redolent of older movies, of 30s and 40s movies, than it is of contemporary 80s. Whereas you see the world of Michael Caine's world in the sauna and in the steam baths as being something which is very much of its time, of that particular time. So I think that is something that is very strong, I think, about the enduring success of Mona Lisa, is that it is another eye on London. And interestingly, the film that I always thought was quite good about that was John Borman's Point Blank, which kind of used San Francisco in a way that I hadn't seen used in a film. Very different views of a more industrial side of San Francisco and a more sort of cynical view of America. And that was quite interesting, because John and Neil had a very strong relationship, and John had been a big help to Neil in getting his career off the ground with Angel, which is the film that I first met Neil on, being a distributor and having released Angel. So I thought that's something really cool about Mona Lisa, and the look of the film was very much in the hands of Roger Pratt and Neil. And Neil worked very closely with Roger in trying to get a kind of a more lurid version of London. I mean, I was lucky enough when I was working at the Scala, I was exposed to that part of King's Cross, and especially behind the cinema, where there was a lot of kind of bizarre prostitution, which was almost like some kind of Indian marketplace or something. It was at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. You could go behind near the gasworks. Now I think partly where St Pancras train has been built, and I think there's a walkway there with a Mona Lisa poster has been erected. But if you go around the back there, you can see between York Way and the back of King's Cross Station, there was just hundreds of girls. I mean, perhaps it's my imagination, but it felt like hundreds of girls, 20, 30, 40, 50 girls just sort of lining the streets, and cars just sort of slowly drifting around, lines and lines of cars, which was incredibly surreal. And it was there for a brief period of maybe a year or 2 years. And I only discovered it because I would lock up the cinema at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and just go for a walk or wander around. If there had been films I'd seen before, or because the Scala Cinema was quite a feature in King's Cross, and we had all-night shows that would start at 11:30 and finish about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And as that was the time when the Tube started, it was literally a captive audience. They were quite popular. It was a time, again, in the 80s when the clubs would close, midnight. So we had a real mixed crowd of people, some of whom would come to see the films and some of whom would be just up for being up all night. But it was, once you got the main bulk of the people in at about 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, there was really, people wouldn't travel to the Scala to come in to see the films. By then it was literally, that will be your audience, and the cinema will be secure, really. And you could sort of wander around and observe the kind of the nightlife of King's Cross. King's Cross was active, being a station all night, so the flourishing world of prostitution was literally part of the scene in King's Cross. There was so much happening in that area, and there was a 24-hour amusement arcade, for instance, just opposite the King's Cross, which was part again of the kind of the nightlife. So the inspiration for Mona Lisa was a story that Chris Brown, who was the co-producer with me on Absolute Beginners, had brought me a sort of newspaper article about some guy who was in the dock in a court somewhere. It's very vague. I have a vague memory of this, and there was a court case about a fight over whether or not he was a pimp or whether he was protecting these two girls, and it was kind of like a nothing story, really. What I thought was interesting was how, I think because he was Maltese, it was just assumed that he was their pimp, and they were claiming that he wasn't their pimp. They weren't making money for him. He was protecting them from some other evil person. And that, combined with the program I saw about Paul Raymond, and how although the Maltese aren't in Mona Lisa, strangely, but it was weirdly the program again about how the Maltese have taken over Soho, and they ran all the clubs and all and in fact we discovered in the course of the program that in fact Paul Raymond owned all those clubs. So I sort of thrown a few ideas to Neil about this, and he said, "Oh, okay, that sounds interesting," and he sort of went off and tried to work on something. I think Neil's idea was always to have someone who was slightly, had come from a very violent background, but had been away for a while, like someone who'd been asleep, and then they had to wake up to the modern world. But he never really got a script that, or got the story to a place where he's happy. So I had suggested bringing in David Leland, who had written and directed a movie called Wish You Were Here, which my company Palace released. And Neil was very happy to embrace David, and then when David had written the script, which was a tougher version, closer to the Sean Connery kind of character that he was playing in the 70s and 80s, quite a sort of hard guy. I suppose a bit close to the character that Bob Hoskins played in Long Good Friday, a meaner, quite Get Carter kind of character. And I don't think Neil liked that very much. So although there was no real disagreement, Neil decided that he would then rewrite the script. So it was quite a fruitful collaboration, because I think David sort of basically prodded Neil. And of course Neil made the whole thing his own. It was really very much, Neil's story and Neil's thing, and that story of the Bob Hoskins character is very close to the characters that Neil portrays in his other work, in his both his written, in his prose, his fiction, and his books, his short stories, and in his other movies. So, you know, he kind of it was a good spur for Neil to kind of own the whole thing. But it was a very it was interesting that kind of, you know, the idea of Mona Lisa came out of really London at that time, and the dichotomy between the time when gangsters, as portrayed by Michael Caine in the film, and as sort of very, very loosely based on Paul Raymond, gangsters wore suits and went to charity events and were perceived to be fairly much, you know, sort of moral bastions of society, and had sort of given up robbing banks, and the whole idea of, I suppose, what the porn industry and the sex industry was, in a way, embraced. And behind that, of course, there was drugs, and there was everything else that was going on, and there was a kind of hedonistic world that there was an unwritten kind of allowance of. There was a sort of acceptance of this world, and it no longer seemed to be a criminal world. It no longer seemed to be crime. It seemed as if a certain amount of license was given to people that were able, and they were able to exploit that through their respectability. So there's something about that which I think is in Mona Lisa, which I always thought was kind of scarier than the old idea of bank robbers and the old idea of criminals being there being a sort of, I suppose, the beginning of the film when Bob Hoskins brings the White Rabbit into the Michael Caine office suggests some kind of code amongst criminals, that there is something that still unites them, and that sort of that notion, which of course was always a relatively ridiculous notion anyway, that there is no honour amongst thieves. You know, that notion that there is honour amongst thieves is something that's perpetuated in those films, like The Italian Job. That was really the thing to prick, was that there's definitely no honour amongst thieves, and that there was definitely, for Bob Hoskins' kind of idea, that somehow society was as it was in the swinging 60s, when, you know, you then being a criminal or being part of that criminal world was something that was slightly sexy and slightly cool, and in fact it never was. It was always grimy and seedy and hidebound by its own horrible rules.